The breakfast rush at the Fairmont Hotel in Calgary had just begun to wind down when the boy appeared at the entrance of the dining room. He was perhaps 11 years old, wearing a gray hoodie that was 2 sizes too big and jeans that had been washed so many times the knees had gone white. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, clutching the hand of a girl even smaller than himself, 4 years old at most, with dark circles under her eyes and a plastic barrette shaped like a daisy holding back her tangled hair. The boy looked around the room with the careful, measuring gaze of someone much older than his years. Not the gaze of a child looking for adventure. The gaze of someone doing arithmetic. The dining room was nearly empty by then. A few business travelers finishing their coffee. A couple near the window splitting a stack of pancakes. And at a corner table, alone with a cup of black coffee and a plate of eggs he'd barely touched, sat a man named Douglas Hartwell. Douglas was 58 years old, though most people guessed older. He had the kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled into something more interesting. Weathered, precise, with eyes the color of a lake in November. He'd built his company from a single logistics depot in Red Deer into one of the largest freight operations in Western Canada. And he'd done it by paying attention to things other people walked past. That habit had never left him. He noticed the boy immediately. He watched the boy survey the room, watched him spot the half-eaten plates on the bussing cart near the kitchen entrance, watched the small calculation happen behind those careful eyes. Then the boy straightened his shoulders in a way that broke Douglas's heart a little, that particular kind of small dignity that children manufacture when they're about to do something that frightens them, and he walked across the dining room floor toward Douglas's table. The little girl followed, her free hand pressed against her stomach. The boy stopped 2 feet away. He didn't fidget. "Excuse me, sir," he said. His voice was steady. "When you're finished, could we have what's left on your plate? My sister hasn't eaten since yesterday." Douglas Hartwell set down his coffee cup. The boy's name was Calloway. Not a name most people used anymore, but his grandmother had chosen it. She'd had a thing for old names, she always said, names that had some weight to them. The little girl was Blythe. She was 4.5, and she hadn't spoken much since the previous October, when their mother had left for the last time. Calloway was 11 years and 3 months old, and for the past 4 months he had been the person keeping them both alive. It had started the way these things always start, not with a single catastrophic moment, but with a slow erosion. Their mother, Renata, had struggled for years. There had been good stretches, long ones sometimes, and Calloway had learned not to trust them too deeply, which is a terrible thing for a child to learn. Their grandmother Eugenia had been the one constant, keeping her apartment on the east side of Calgary, always with the same jar of peanut butter in the cupboard, and the same yellow quilt on the fold-out couch, and the same way of pulling Calloway against her side when things got bad at home, saying, "You let me worry about tomorrow, sweetheart. Tonight you just breathe." But Eugenia had had a stroke in September. She was in a care facility in Airdrie now, and she knew Calloway when he came to visit. Most of the time, but she couldn't speak much, and she certainly couldn't take them in. Social services had done what social services do. They'd put Calloway and Blythe in a temporary placement with a foster family in the northeast end of the city. The foster family was not unkind, exactly. They were simply overwhelmed. 3 other children already, a small house, a mother who worked evenings, and a father who traveled. Calloway and Blythe occupied a single room with a space heater that made a clicking sound all night. Then the foster father had lost his job in February, and the family had moved to Lethbridge to be closer to his parents, and somewhere in that chaos of boxes and arrangements and last-minute decisions, the placement had simply unraveled. There'd been a miscommunication between caseworkers. A file that sat on someone's desk for a week too long. It happened. Calloway had not told anyone. He was 11 years and 3 months old, and he had learned that telling adults about problems often made the problems worse in ways that were unpredictable. So he had taken Blythe, and he had done what his grandmother had always done. He had kept them warm, and he had found food, and he had kept moving. They had been sleeping in the lobby of a community center on 16th Avenue. The night security guard, a man named Eddie, had looked the other way, which was its own kind of grace. But the center had closed for renovations 3 days ago. The previous 2 nights had been spent in a 24-hour Tim Hortons on Macleod Trail, nursing a single medium hot chocolate between them, until the overnight manager had gently asked them to move along. Calloway knew the Fairmont had a warm lobby. He'd passed it once on the C train and remembered the way the light looked through those tall windows, golden and heavy, the kind of light that felt like it cost something. He hadn't planned to go inside the dining room. He'd only meant to sit in the lobby for a while, where it was warm. But then he'd seen the busing cart, and then he'd done the arithmetic, and then he'd straightened his shoulders, the way Eugenia had taught him. Head up. Cal, whatever you're walking toward, you walk toward it straight. And he'd walked across that marble floor to the corner table, where a man in a gray suit sat alone with a plate of food he wasn't eating. Douglas didn't answer right away. He looked at the boy, at the careful eyes, the steady hands, the oversized hoodie, and then he looked at the little girl, who was watching him with an expression of absolute seriousness, as though the outcome of this interaction was something she had prepared herself for in advance. He pulled out the chair across from him. "Sit down," he said. "Both of you. We don't want to be any trouble," the boy said immediately. "You're not trouble. Sit down." They sat. Blythe climbed into the chair and sat with her hands in her lap and her chin barely clearing the table. Calloway sat on the edge of his seat, the way someone sits when they're ready to leave quickly. Douglas raised his hand and caught the attention of the nearest server, a young woman named Priya, who had been watching this exchange from the service station with an expression caught between concern and uncertainty. "Can we get 2 more breakfasts, please?" he said. "Full menu, whatever they'd like." Calloway shook his head quickly. "We don't need, you said your sister hasn't eaten since yesterday," Douglas said. Not harshly, simply. The way someone states a fact, that's a long time, let her choose. Something shifted in the boy's face. A very small thing, but Douglas caught it, the almost imperceptible loosening of a jaw that had been clenched for a very long time. Blythe looked at the menu that Priya placed in front of her. She looked at it for a while. Then she pointed to the picture of the pancakes with blueberries. "Those ones," she said. It was the first thing she'd said all morning. Calloway ordered scrambled eggs and toast, and he did it quietly, and then he sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at Douglas with those November Lake eyes and said, "Why are you doing this?" Douglas picked up his coffee. "Because I can," he said, "and because it seems like someone should." He didn't push for the story. He let it come the way these things come when you don't crowd them, slowly, sideways, in pieces. By the time Blythe had made it halfway through her pancakes, Douglas knew about Eugenia's stroke, and the foster placement, and the file that had sat too long on someone's desk. He knew about the community center lobby and the Tim Hortons and the 2 nights in the cold. He knew that Calloway had been to see Eugenia twice since February, taking the bus to Airdrie alone, and that each time Eugenia had held his hand and said, "You're a good boy, Cal. You're a good boy," and that those visits were the thing Calloway mentioned last and most carefully, as though they were fragile. He also knew that the boy had not cried once, not through any of it. By the time Blythe had finished her pancakes and was working on the last of her orange juice with the focused dedication of someone completing important work, Douglas had made 2 phone calls under his breath and sent 3 text messages. His assistant, a fiercely competent woman named Adelaide, had already begun making arrangements. But there was one more call he needed to make himself. "I need to tell you something," he said to Calloway. The boy looked at him steadily. "I have a house in Mount Royal. It has a guest wing that hasn't been used since my daughter moved to Vancouver. Tonight, I'd like you and your sister to stay there." He paused. "If you're willing." Calloway didn't answer immediately. He was 11 years old, and he had learned not to accept things without thinking them through first, which is another terrible thing for a child to have to learn. "We don't know you," he said. "No," Douglas agreed. "You don't. That's a reasonable thing to note." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and put a business card on the table. "My name is Douglas Hartwell. You can look me up on your phone right now if you'd like. There's a photograph. You can confirm I'm the same person." He slid his phone across the table. "You can also call the non-emergency police line and read them my name and ask if there's anything you should know about me. I'll wait." Calloway looked at the phone. He looked at the business card. He looked at Douglas. "You'd actually wait," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'd actually wait," Douglas said. Calloway picked up the phone. "There are people in the world who do not understand what it costs a child to ask for help, who mistake the asking for weakness or for boldness, when in fact it is neither. It is just mathematics, the purest kind, the kind that says what is the risk of this and what is the risk of not this and which number is larger. Calloway ran the numbers. He called the non-emergency line. He gave Douglas's name to the dispatcher in a clear, careful voice and waited while the woman on the other end did whatever she did. He said thank you when she finished. He ended the call and put the phone down on the table. "Okay," he said. The guest wing of Douglas Hartwell's house in Mount Royal had its own bathroom with heated floors and a bedroom with 2 twin beds and curtains the color of cream. Blythe walked in and stood in the middle of the room for a moment and then sat on the edge of one of the beds and pressed her hand flat against the duvet, testing it, the way you test something you're not sure is real. "It's soft," she said. "Yeah," Calloway said. He was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, still watching, still calculating. Adelaide, Douglas's assistant, who turned out to also be his neighbor and who had known him for 22 years, had shown them to the room and brought towels and asked Blythe in a matter-of-fact way whether she preferred her bath with or without bubbles. Blythe had looked at Adelaide for a long moment and then held up 2 fingers, which apparently meant both, and which made Adelaide smile in a way that reached all the way to her eyes. Douglas stood in the hallway while Adelaide settled them in. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but sat somewhere between the two, in the place where old losses and new grace sometimes meet. His daughter's name was Simone. She was 31 now, living in Vancouver with her partner, doing work she loved. But when she was 11, she had been sick, very sick, for almost 2 years, and Douglas had sat in a great many hospital hallways, and he had watched a great many nurses move through a great many corridors with their particular competent kindness, and he had learned during those years exactly what it looked like when a child needed someone to simply stay. He'd stayed for Simone. He could stay now. The problem arrived the following morning in the form of a woman named Vivica Strand. Vivica was a case manager at the Calgary Child and Family Services office, where Calloway and Blythe's file had been sitting on a desk for longer than it should have. She was not a bad person. She was overworked and under-resourced and managing a caseload that would have broken someone with less determination. And she arrived at Douglas's door at 9 in the morning with the expression of a woman who has spent the night preparing for a difficult conversation. She explained, with careful politeness, that Douglas was not a licensed foster provider, that there were regulations for a reason, that the children needed to be assessed, that proper channels existed to protect them. Douglas listened to all of this. Then he said, "I agree with everything you've said. I would like to walk through every channel with you, starting now, in whatever order you recommend." He paused. "I would also like to introduce you to Adelaide Mercer, who is a licensed family care provider and who lives 4 houses down this street and who has agreed to serve as the official placement address while we complete this process." Vivica blinked. "I've also retained a family lawyer named Thornton Delaney," Douglas added, "who is available by phone whenever you need him and who has already been in touch with your supervisor." There was a silence. "You did all of this morning," Vivica said. "I did it last night," Douglas said. "I don't sleep much." But even Thornton Delaney and Adelaide Mercer and 22 years of Douglas Hartwell's formidable organizational capability couldn't entirely smooth the weeks that followed. The bureaucratic process moved at the pace it moved. There were forms and assessments, and a visit to Eugenia in Airdrie, where the old woman gripped Calloway's hand and looked at Douglas across the room with eyes that were still, behind the damage of the stroke, entirely lucid. Douglas met her gaze and gave her a small nod, and something passed between them that required no translation. Calloway, meanwhile, was enrolled in school. The same school he'd attended before everything had shifted, which meant he could find his locker without thinking, and he knew which of the teachers meant well and which ones you had to watch, and he went without complaint, though Douglas could see the cost of it in the set of his shoulders when he came home. The other kids had the particular cruelty of children who sense that someone has been away somewhere they can't name, and they sharpened that sensing into comments that were never quite cruel enough to report, and never quite small enough to dismiss. Calloway handled it the way he handled most things, by being more competent than anyone expected and waiting for them to run out of material. But there was one afternoon, a Thursday in early April, when the snow was still on the ground, but the light had changed in that particular way it does in Calgary in the spring, pale and tentative and full of something not yet arrived. When Calloway came home and went straight upstairs without speaking, and Douglas stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened to the silence from the guest wing and made a decision. He climbed the stairs. He knocked on the door. "I'm fine," Calloway said. "I know," Douglas said. "Can I come in anyway?" A pause. Then sure. He sat in the chair by the window. Calloway was sitting on the edge of his bed looking at his hands. Blythe was asleep on the other bed. She napped most afternoons still, as though the body was still catching up on something owed. They sat in silence for a while. Douglas didn't try to fill it. "Do you ever get tired?" Calloway said eventually, not quite a question, "of having to be the person who keeps everything from falling apart?" Douglas looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, I have been very tired at different times in my life. What did you do?" "I let someone help me," Douglas said, "eventually. It took me longer than it should have." Calloway thought about this. His jaw was doing that thing again, the thing Douglas had learned to recognize, the slight tightening that happened when he was holding something back. "My grandmother used to say that asking for help was just smart math," Calloway said. "She said it wasn't weakness. She said the people who won't ask are the ones who don't understand how the numbers work." "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Douglas said. "She is," Calloway said. Present tense, deliberate. Douglas nodded. "I'd like to meet her properly sometime, not just through the glass." Something in Calloway's face shifted, and this time the shift was larger. He didn't cry. Douglas had still not seen him cry, but something behind his eyes went soft for just a moment, the way ice goes soft in that first real week of spring, before anyone quite believes it. "Yeah," he said. "She'd like you, I think." The complication, because there is always a complication in the way that real life insists on providing them, arrived in the form of a woman named Serena Blythe Forsyth. Serena was a lifestyle blogger with 340,000 followers on Instagram, and she had been at the Fairmont that morning in March when Calloway had walked across the dining room floor. She'd been sitting 2 tables away, working on her laptop, and she'd taken a photograph, not of the children, exactly, but of the room, the composition of it, the light through the windows, and in the background, soft and slightly out of focus, you could see a small figure in a gray hoodie and a man in a gray suit leaning across a table toward her. She'd posted it without thinking much about it, the way you post things when they feel like they mean something and you're not sure exactly what. The caption was something about unexpected grace. The image had been shared 11,000 times in 3 days. Someone recognized the Fairmont. Someone recognized the man as Douglas Hartwell, because Douglas Hartwell was not an unknown person in Calgary. And then a journalist named Kieran Walsh at the Calgary Herald had started making calls. Douglas found out on a Wednesday morning when Adelaide texted him a link with the message, "This is going to require a conversation." The article, when it ran the following Monday, was careful and well-intentioned and said all the things that careful, well-intentioned articles say about generosity and the failures of the social system and one man's decision to step in, where institutions had not. It used Calloway's first name only, and it did not photograph either of the children, because Walsh had enough decency to understand that children do not consent to being case studies. But the attention arrived anyway, the way attention does, sideways, persistent, assuming its own welcome. Neighbors leaving notes in Douglas's mailbox. Local radio wanting an interview. A woman from a morning show in Toronto calling Adelaide's number 4 times in 2 days. Calloway found out because he saw the article on a classmate's phone. He came home that afternoon and set his backpack down very carefully by the front door and went to find Douglas in the study. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I didn't know how to yet," Douglas said. "That was wrong of me. I'm sorry." Calloway stood in the doorway. He was doing the thing with his jaw again. "Are people going to come here?" he said. "To the house?" "No," Douglas said. "I've spoken to a lawyer and to Walsh at the Herald. No one is coming here. Are they going to talk about Blythe?" "No one is going to talk about Blythe." "Are they going to—" Calloway stopped. He looked at the floor. He looked back up. "Are they going to try to make it about something it's not? Like some kind of story that people can feel good about?" Douglas thought about this. He owed the boy an honest answer. "Some of them will try," he said. "That's what attention does. It flattens things. It takes something complicated and makes it something simple. He paused. But what actually happened, what is actually happening, that belongs to us, not to them. I want you to know that. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Eugenia says stories are how people make sense of things they can't hold, he said. She says you can't blame people for needing them. You can only make sure you know the real one yourself. Douglas looked at the 11-year-old boy standing in his study doorway, and he thought, your grandmother made you extraordinary and I hope she knows it. That's exactly right, he said. The hearing, when it finally came, was on a Tuesday in May, with new leaves on the elms outside the family court building on Center Street. Thornton Delaney had filed the paperwork 3 weeks earlier. Adelaide was present as the licensed care provider of record. Viveka Strand from Child and Family Services had, after considerable deliberation and several long conversations with Douglas and with Calloway himself, because Viveka was overworked but she was not incurious, and she had started to pay attention, filed a supporting statement. Calloway wore a collared shirt he'd chosen himself from the rack at a second-hand shop on 17th Avenue, navy blue, with small white checks. He sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Blythe asleep against his shoulder and his hands folded in his lap, and he did not fidget. Douglas sat beside him. Are you nervous? Calloway asked. A little, Douglas said. You? No, Calloway said. Then, yes. A bit. That seems like the right amount, Douglas said. Calloway's mouth curved. It was the expression Douglas had come to think of as his almost smile, the one that lived just at the edge of something warmer, the one that showed up more often now than it had in March, incrementally, the way longer days show up in spring. The judge's name was Honorata Reyes Delgado, and she had been a family court judge for 19 years, and she had the particular quality of presence that comes from having listened, with genuine attention, to a very large number of human stories. She asked Douglas 3 questions, and Calloway 2, and she asked Blythe, who was awake by then, and sitting with her hands folded in a precise imitation of her brother, whether she liked where she was living. Blythe considered the question with appropriate seriousness. The floors are warm, she said, in the bathroom. Judge Reyes Delgado made a note. They stopped at Dairy Queen on the way home because Blythe had requested it before the hearing, with the particular careful specificity of someone who has learned not to assume things will happen until they actually happen. And Douglas had said, absolutely. Whatever you want. And she had said, chocolate dipped, please, the ones with the crispy outside with great precision. They sat in a booth by the window. Outside, the May light was doing its best, tentative still, the way Calgary spring always is, but earnest, the kind of light that means it. Calloway was eating his cone with quiet concentration. Blythe was rotating hers carefully to catch the drips. Douglas was watching them both in the particular way he'd developed over the past 2 months, not hovering, just present, just paying attention, the way you pay attention to things you don't want to miss. Can I ask you something? Calloway said. Of course. Why did you stay? After the first morning, he wasn't looking at Douglas, he was looking at his cone, turning it slowly. You gave us breakfast, and you could have just left it there, called someone, done the right thing and moved on. He looked up. Why did you stay? Douglas thought about Simone, 11 years old, in a hospital bed, and himself in a hallway learning how to stay. He thought about the particular arithmetic of presence, the simple math that says the cost of staying is less than the cost of what you leave behind when you go. He thought about a boy straightening his shoulders in a hotel doorway, manufacturing dignity out of nothing at all, doing the bravest small thing Douglas had ever seen. Because you walked across that room, he said, and you asked for help. You were frightened, and you were exhausted, and you did it anyway. He paused. I've been doing things like that my whole life, walking across rooms I was frightened to cross, and somebody always stayed. I just finally understood that I was supposed to be that person sometimes, not just the one walking. Calloway looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded, once, the way someone nods when they've heard something that settles into place. Blythe finished her cone and looked at the two of them with her serious 4-year-old eyes. Can we visit Grandma Eugenia tomorrow? She said. Yes, Calloway said, before Douglas could answer. Yes, Douglas said at the same moment. They looked at each other, and for the first time, unhurried, unguarded, arriving the way spring finally arrives in Calgary, without announcement and without apology. Calloway smiled.